Mia Gradney here, along with Grace White in the KHOU 11 News studio. It's 1 week since the awful and terrible mass shooting in San Jacinto. 5 people killed. So much has transpired in this 1 week, from the manhunt to the arrest and capture of Francisco Oropeza to now the investigation. There really is so much here to discuss with this case and so much to unpack. But Grace, I think where we should really start is with the victims and the community, and just how traumatic this has been, not just for those families who lost a loved one, but the greater community there in San Jacinto County.
Everybody who's heard about this case knows it's a tragedy, Mia, but I think being there, being in the community, talking to people who knew these victims, it really, it was a hard story to cover. I'll never forget being in the neighborhood and kind of driving by the house, and there was this impromptu vigil. Dozens of people came together and they formed this prayer circle, and they surrounded this memorial that was growing next to a tree in front of the victim's home, and they just stood there for several minutes, shouting, crying, praying, lifting the names up of these victims. And afterwards, we had the chance to visit with just some people that came. I wanted to know how people were connected, if they were people who knew the family or lived down the street or whatnot, and there was a little bit of everything. But one child, Mia, I'll never forget, this boy says he is best friends with Daniel, the child that died, the 9-year-old, and he wrote him a note. And I had seen the note in the memorial, and I thought, okay, that is, wow, that looks like a child's handwriting. And there was a little picture of his friend with angel wings, and then he drew the gates of heaven. And at that point, when I first saw the letter, I didn't know who wrote it. And then just as we were talking to people in the crowd, I met the mother and asked permission to interview her son. And I just stood there for a few minutes. I'll never forget talking to that little boy about his best friend who he lost. It made it so real, and it was such a reminder to me as a reporter and a journalist that this story touched so many people. His mom, I also interviewed her, told me, I hate that they have to go through something like this so little. A lot of times in these stories we think about, the families and the law enforcement and kind of all the people that are affected, but the children in this story, the children that knew this family.
They were so innocent, right? And just playing with his friend in the days past, and now having to write a letter to him.
Yeah.
It's a different viewpoint from someone who just shouldn't have to go through this, is the toughest part of this. And I think, just the fear that community felt, they really had been on this roller coaster of emotions, right? So grief, but before the grief, there was this great sense of fear because of the heinous acts that had been committed in that one house.
And the night I met that mother and son that brought the letter to the memorial outside the home, he was still on the run. Nobody knew where this guy was. And I actually asked families out there, because many of them lived in the neighborhood, I said, are you going home tonight? Are you staying in your home? And they said, yes. Where else would we go? We're locking our doors. Many of them told me they had, guns and ways to protect their own families if it came to that. But there was a real fear, Mia, you're right, about would this man emerge from the woods and kill again? Nobody knew how long this manhunt would go. It went 4 days, but for the people in that community, it felt like an eternity. And everybody, it's a close-knit community. I mean, it's very, very, very rural, but everybody knows everybody. And so everybody was affected by this. And you mentioned something earlier, the kids playing together. Even the gunman's child. Even the gunman's child. People said, oh yes, we know his child from the neighborhood. We played with his child. I mean, so there's so many connections. And you're right, people just did not know how this was going to end. And as we were driving through the neighborhood too, the longer it went on, there were posters and pictures in English and in Spanish asking people to turn him in.
I bet. The thing, too, that really resonated with me, there were so many images throughout the week that we saw in your reporting. Matt Doherty was also up at the scene for several nights as well, covering the story. But everything from that little boy and his letter. But you mentioned that they were locking themselves in their homes and some of them were arming themselves. I remember we had a woman who, she didn't show us her face, but she showed us her gun. And she was putting it in her pants, in her tights. She was arming herself as she was walking around. To me, it just really spoke to the fear in that community and what needed to be done in order to ensure their safety without knowing where this threat was.
We met different people that were patrolling their own properties that told me they were now, because it's a rural community, doing their own surveillance and calling in tips when they saw something suspicious. But people were kind of taking matters into their own hands. They felt like they had to because they didn't know what was going to happen. You mentioned the pictures. I think it's interesting now that the manhunt is over and that he's in custody. You can look back, you can see all the different pictures that law enforcement released, and some of them look drastically different. So a lot of people did know this family and did know him and knew who they were looking for, but other people in the broader community and the surrounding counties, he was found in Montgomery County, a different county than where this started in San Jacinto. So this touched several different counties, and a lot of people we talked to said, oh my goodness, those pictures look different. And at one point the FBI released
the wrong picture.
The wrong picture. So I think there was this rush early on to get photos and images out there because early on people thought, hey, maybe he went to the border, maybe he went to Mexico. Mm-hmm. And we now know from court documents he was trying to get to Mexico. He sent his wife to ask cousins if they would take him to Mexico. They turned him down, according to court documents that we've seen. But it's interesting that, you know, his picture was basically plastered everywhere by the end of it.
I think another thing that is interesting to me and another observation and something that you just spoke to was the fact that people were patrolling their own properties, doing their own surveillance, and that maybe was warranted, Grace, because you learned and heard this week from law enforcement there are challenges there in being a small rural county. They just don't have the manpower, correct?
Yes, in San Jacinto County where this happened, the shootings happened, there are 3 deputies, the sheriff told us, on patrol in the entire county at one time. So they have different shifts that come on. But when this happened, there was another call that they were on involving, I think, an armed robbery. It was a violent call. And they had to actually leave that call to respond to these 5 murders. So they said, look, we're a large county, we are a rural county. And the sheriff at one of the later press conferences said, we're hiring. He said, look, we are short-staffed. Welcome to rural law enforcement. It was a really interesting week to drive those roads, Mia. I'll never forget how bumpy the roads were getting into the neighborhood. It doesn't matter if we're trying to get there with lights and sirens on. I mean, you would be slowed down by the roads into the neighborhood.
Right, and I assume we're talking about a rural area, the lighting as well too. So we're talking about rough roads, limited lighting as well. So there are challenges in trying to get somewhere timely.
Absolutely, and we know rural counties only have so much in their budget, and certainly they're doing the best they can. They told us they're trying to, but they said we are short-staffed.
Mm-hmm. Presented unique challenges, that's for sure. And let's talk about the close proximity, Grace, of where Oropeza, the suspect, and now charged with the murders of those 5 victims. Let's talk about the close proximity of the home that he was found in and taken into custody to where his home and where the scene of these murders happened.
Well, we now know from court documents and from law enforcement sources that house where he was found hiding under the laundry, by the way, I'll never forget when the sheriff said that at the press conference, that he was hiding underneath piles of laundry.
In a closet.
In a closet. I mean, so we now know that it's his aunt's house from law enforcement sources and court documents. So he's at his aunt's house, and this, Mia, through our investigation, is an address that law enforcement has had since last summer. This is a relative's address that last year, when there was a protective order filed between Oropeza and his wife, she filed it against him. That address was one of the addresses they went to several times to actually try to find him to serve him on this protective order. They never could find him. So many people have been writing in asking questions about, if he had a previous criminal history or if he had a history of being deported to Mexico. Why wasn't there more intervention before all this tragedy? All valid questions. But what we're finding, at least in that case from the summer prior to this, is that they were looking for him, Mia, but they could never find him. And his aunt's house is one of the places they went on Summer Hollow. So it's interesting. It's close in the sense that it's in a different county. It's a little far to completely walk. They do believe he had transportation. They're not exactly sure of the timeline. They haven't fully released all of those things. The investigation's still ongoing.
And we know you're asking, that's for sure.
Of course. But he did get there. And it wasn't a place that was unfamiliar to him. Right. It was in his family.
Or law enforcement, for that matter.
Right.
Let's talk about the wife. She was taken into custody as well, charged. There's so much interest around her. What have you been able to dig and to gather as far as she's concerned and possible involvement here?
I think one of the most interesting things is this protective order. I have it right here in my hand that I mentioned. She filed on him last summer. In this protective order, it says he cannot possess a firearm, any guns. He cannot pick up his child from school. He has to leave his home immediately, move out. I mean, she requested that the court file this restraining order against her husband, and the court said, you got to go. You have to leave, and you can't have any guns. So it's really interesting. We also know, Mia, we asked all weekend about her and about what was going on in the house leading up to the 5 murders. And law enforcement said they were talking to her throughout the manhunt. They said they were in communication with her.
She was cooperating.
Yes, and so they were talking to her throughout the manhunt. We don't know exactly how much information she gave them or they asked of her, but we know that the two parties were talking. And then now we know the San Jacinto County DA said in a press conference, I actually went back and listened to it because there's been so much information this week. You really have to go back and listen to all the little nuggets to put it together. But the DA in San Jacinto County, when asked what her role was, said she supplied him food, she supplied him clothes, and he believes she arranged the transportation to the aunt's house. So, and we know now she's charged in Montgomery County with helping him.
Yeah, it's interesting to learn more about that protective order, what may have been going on there, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. I'm sure there is so much more that we want to know. I think people want to know if she was under any type of threat by him because he did have a history of violence there, and if that played any role in her actions or not. But these are all things to come that likely the DA is investigating as well as law enforcement too. Where do we go from here in moving forward with this case, Grace? Of course, we're going to have other court appearances that are made. There is another person who was arrested, has not faced charges directly related to, and correct me here, to Oropeza aiding and abetting or being of any type of assistance there. There's another player involved.
Right, and that person has been identified as a friend of Oropeza by law enforcement on the record. They have said he is Oropeza's friend. Also on the record, which is interesting, I had to go back and listen to it to make sure that I heard it correctly. The San Jacinto County DA said this friend, they believe, helped Oropeza leave the neighborhood. Now, you're right, though. There's a lot of things in motion in terms of this investigation, and you're right, they have not charged him with helping Oropeza escape today. Initially, he was picked up on a drug charge in San Jacinto County. He's been in the San Jacinto County jail for several days now, and
now it's a weapons charge for, I think, someone of illegal status, if I'm correct.
Right. So initially it was just that drug charge at the county level, but now this friend, Domingo Castilla, has been charged federally. So he's going to have to go through not just one court system, but 2 court systems, also on the federal side, for being in possession of a firearm. I talked to ATF agents last night. They say they found with this friend 3 guns, Mia, 1 an AR-style rifle, and they made clear that these guns were found inside his house. Again,
and that's the same type of weapon, once again, the same type of weapon that was used in the murders of the 5 victims, but not the same weapon, same style.
Right, and they made clear that it was in his own residence, so it was not found in Oropeza's residence or the house where Oropeza was found in. But again, they found him in possession of 3 guns, 1 an AR-style rifle, and they also found a fake driver's license on him and did also say he's a Mexican citizen. So a lot of moving parts to this investigation, and really, Mia, what's next, I think, is going to be following right now these 3 suspects that we have that are all, we've confirmed with law enforcement, may not all be charged with the investigation, but are all connected to this investigation. And for Oropeza, the gunman, we know he's going to a grand jury. So that's his next step. And Mia, it's interesting, in San Jacinto County, they do things a little differently. They told us he will go to a grand jury first before there's ever a court hearing. So they want to make sure they have an indictment before he goes into a traditional courtroom that you and I think of with a judge and, you know, the attorneys. And so we also asked if he had representation, because I was just curious if anyone was representing him at this point. And they said they have not yet been contacted by anyone that's representing him, but of course he will be given that opportunity. But it's definitely interesting, and for a grand jury, Mia, it could take up to 90 days. Yes. So that's 3 months. I mean, we could wait 3 months before we see him again in court, and then his friend will also have to go to the grand jury for that drug charge. And then on the federal side, that's a whole nother cycle of hearings that'll now be started because of that federal charge. And then the wife, will she be transported back to San Jacinto County? Will they be in the same jail? Right now, the wife is in Montgomery County. So you have Montgomery County and San Jacinto, and now the feds. So 3 entities involved in these court hearings that we could see over the next several months. But it's interesting, Mia, because we were asking, well, why 90 days? A grand jury meets at the end of May, actually, in San Jacinto. The DA says, I'm not going to rush it. If we're not ready for the end of May, we have 90 days. And he said there are so many law enforcement agencies that worked on this case. They're waiting for all those people to file all their reports and also follow-up interviews. And that's something I wanted to mention, Mia. They told me they're still asking people for tips. They want people to call in tips if people saw or heard or, you know, have any evidence of people helping him. They say they are going to investigate those tips today just as seriously as the tips that led to the capture and arrest of Oropeza, which is really interesting.
It is. It really is just the start of the investigation. And I know we're continuing to ask questions on a daily basis, but it sounds like we're going to get a lot of information once we get to that grand jury appointment in past day.
And one other thing I want to mention, Mia, it was a tip that led to Oropeza's arrest. A tip through the FBI's tip line, that person going to get the $80,000 reward, which is really amazing. The sheriff talked about it takes a village, right? Law enforcement, people in the community, us broadcasting the story. It's really interesting how it all came together.
And they said that they got calls from across the nation.
They did.
Even in regards to this case and Oropeza's
a lot
whereabouts.
Of people were following it. And for it to end after 4 days, it was such a tragedy. But it could have gone on much longer.
And it could have ended so much worse. Absolutely, this has been terrible, but it makes us think back to what happened in Waco with the escapee that left Huntsville, and in between that transportation, you know, we saw just how bad that turned out and just how desperate people who are on the run get and what they are capable of. So we're thankful that they were able to apprehend this suspect, Oropeza, when they did.
And I also want to mention, Mia, that we asked, will this be a capital murder case? And they said they're looking at that. Yes, they said it meets the standard for that. Obviously, when it becomes capital murder, the death penalty is considered, and that's something they said they take very seriously. But that's something that is being considered, as are all the options on the table as this case moves forward.
All right, Grace White, thank you so much for your insight, all the background, the behind the scenes of this case, so much more to come. You can watch Grace's reports, all of our coverage of the San Jacinto mass shooting and the ongoing investigation on our website, khou.com, and of course on the KHOU 11 app.